Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Mission Critical Insights discussion on the future of critical infrastructure, resilience, cybersecurity, and innovation. I'm Joyce Hunter, former Deputy CIO for Policy and Planning at the USDA and interim CIO, and the founder of Data Science Camp, with a career spanning digital information, cybersecurity, open data, workforce development, and public-private integration and operations across government, academia, and industry. I currently serve as the Executive Director for Collaboration, Education, and Research at Mission Critical, a cybersecurity and critical infrastructure think tank focused on advancing resilience, operational security, innovation, workforce readiness, and cross-sector collaboration across some of our nation's most critical and essential infrastructure sectors. Today, we are honored, very honored, to have Tony Scott, who is one of our nation's foremost technology and cybersecurity leaders, for an important conversation on the evolving challenges and opportunities facing critical infrastructure security in America. Tony currently serves as the president and CEO of Intrusion Incorporated and previously served as the federal chief information officer under President Obama, where he oversaw more than $85 billion in federal IT investments and led the government-wide cybersecurity response following the OPM breach. His distinguished career includes executive leadership roles as CIO at VMware, Microsoft, and the Walt Disney Corporation, as well as CTO at General Motors. Tony is widely recognized for his expertise in cybersecurity, digital transformation, AI, cloud adoption, and technology modernization, and is a member of the CIO Hall of Fame. Part one, we're going to talk about our energy infrastructure. Tony, it's been a while. Dating back to 2017, where have you been? You've continued to operate at the intersection of cybersecurity, government, technology, and critical infrastructure. Tell us where you've been focused on for the past few years and what trends concern you most today.
Well, thanks, Joyce, and it's great to join you, for this podcast. So after leaving the federal government, I'd had, as you mentioned, some pretty exciting and fun roles in the private sector over the course of my career. Being federal CIO gives you a different perspective on all kinds of things, but in particular, in this case, on the need for better cybersecurity. So after leaving government, I started investing in early stage technology companies, primarily cybersecurity, and along that journey, in about 4.5 years or so ago, I ran across Intrusion and decided to not only invest but also become part of the management team at Intrusion because of the very unique nature of Intrusion's technology and the things that it was focused on. So that's kept me pretty busy. We were kind of a turnaround situation. I won't go into all the details on that, but we've been a long time partner of the U.S. federal government, DoD, and also the private sector as well. So it's been my personal joy and pleasure to join this company and try to advance the state of cybersecurity, particularly particularly focused on critical infrastructure. And so I'm excited to have this conversation today.
That's great. And it has been an iterative process over the last few years. And as you said, critical infrastructure has become a frontline target in geopolitical conflict, cybercrime, economic disruption. From your perspective, what fundamentally motivates adversaries to target critical infrastructure rather than traditional IT systems?
Well, I think there's a couple of factors depending on who the actor is. The nation state actors do it for a very specific set of reasons. they want to cripple critical infrastructure prior to launching some other, more kinetic sort of activity, usually, as do we. I mean, that's a part of the modern playbook of modern warfare, quite frankly. But some of it's also for just morale destroying reasons.
Mm.
If you can take out critical infrastructure in a broad enough space where daily living becomes difficult because water doesn't work or telecom doesn't work or roads and highways don't work or transportation doesn't work, that can have a pretty debilitating impact on society. Um, when it comes to the sort of criminal group, these are pretty vulnerable environments, quite frankly, in a lot of cases. And it's a great source of making money, of,
Mm.
getting
Mhm.
ransomware paid and so on. So there could be a variety of different motivations, but the fact that this is a fairly vulnerable set of assets makes it a easier target than, say, a big bank, a big international bank or something like that.
Yeah, those critical infrastructures, particularly that can harm, hurt, or kill people, are the ones that are most vulnerable, right? Because you're talking with the general population, which can then escalate into anarchy.
Yes, exactly. And as you know, quite often these are very local, cellular sorts of organizations. There's no big, like I said, an international bank running these things. It's a set of local authorities with limited budget, limited expertise. And that's one of the factors that makes this a critical thing for us to address because all of these need help um, in a variety of different ways.
Absolutely. Now, in your experience, what are the most common vulnerabilities or operational blind spots that make critical infrastructure owners especially susceptible to attack?
Well, let me put it to you this way, and this is how I think about it. If you were going to go build a resilient, highly protected thing today, whether it's water or energy or telecom, whatever, there's a set of best practices and things that you would do to make yourself, highly resilient and well protected from the kinds of attacks that we know can exist today. And so that's, kind of the state of the art model that you would aspire to if you're going to build from new. But if you compare that to what exists today, you'll see a sliding scale of things that are not up to that spec or way below that spec or not even on the spec sheet, if you will, uh, to some degree. And a lot of it has to do with the time in history when these things were built, um, the time in history when these things were connected to the internet in some fashion, and a host of other things, including, just better building materials in terms of, the actual physical materials that are used to build these systems. And so if you're operating one of these critical infrastructure activities and it's not at the modern, sort of spec that you would do if you were starting from scratch, you can now sort of start to figure out what your vulnerabilities are and, the cost and the time that it might take to, bring things up to a modern sort of specification and operational capability and so on. And that gap can be pretty big, as you can imagine.
Now, going back over what you just said, now, so are these failures technology, governance, workforce shortages, or plain and simple investment gaps?
Well, I think, you got to look at each individual case, but it's Probably a combination of all of those in some sense. You may remember during the last part of the Obama administration, I was a big advocate of, and I've done this in the private sector as well, of assigning a useful life to everything in my purview, whether
Mhm.
it's software, hardware, facilities, even skill sets. Because even with people there and processes and so on, there's a theoretical useful life where they become, more of a handicap or a liability in some sense than an asset. With people, it's, doing the right kind of training, making sure you're hiring, the right kind of skill sets, and making sure you're running the right kind of operational exercises to be prepared and so on. But on the physical side, it's, modern equipment that often is cheaper to operate than the old stuff that it's replacing.
Mhm.
And if you have this inventory and have a way of upgrading or replacing things when they become end of life or end of useful life, then you can have a hope of keeping up and keeping a relevant and appropriate stack of technologies and people assets and processes that
Mhm.
uh, respond to the modern need. Now, it's hard to do, and it's especially painful if you've never done it
So,
because it can be overwhelming. But taken in bite-sized chunks over time, you can really make progress and I think do your organization well as serve society better.
well, we can definitely languish on, all the things that happened in the past, those things that helped us become better. The OPM breach, FITARA, TBM, you name it, we can talk about it. But let's dive into one of those segments now, which is energy.
Sure.
If you look at the global and geopolitical instability that continues to place pressure on energy markets, how concerned should U.S. organizations be about cyber attacks designed to exploit energy volatility or supply chain disruption?
Well, I think we should be very concerned. What we've seen is examples, even as recent as Ukraine and other places or the Middle East, where disruption of those uh, energy activities have worldwide, global sorts of impacts, supply chain impacts, economic impacts, health and welfare impacts, and so on. And the reality is today, um, physical penetration into a network isn't required anymore at all.
Mhm.
Um, Attacks can be launched from somebody's basement anywhere in the world. I'm sitting on my boat in Marina del Rey today, and if I chose to, I could launch an attack, from my boat on the way to Catalina, kind of thing. And these are aided by, AI and all kinds of uh, new technologies that have just really, blossomed even in the last couple of years, that give new tools and new techniques and scale, and lethality to what used to take a long time to put together now can be done, pretty quickly by almost anyone.
But if you look at both the disruption and destruction, what other kinds of strategic outcomes are the adversary seeking?
Well, it could be strategic advantage, it could be economic, it could be psychological warfare. I mean, there's a whole
Mm.
bunch of motivations there, depending on the time frame and the uh, objectives of the adversary. One of the things that we know is that um, the big ones that we all worry about are very patient. They're happy to gather a lot of intelligence, learn about our technologies, learn about our vulnerabilities, um, refresh that information over time, in effect, do surveillance so that if and when they're ready to attack, all the puzzle pieces are in place. They don't start on day one saying, oh, now let's go figure out where all the vulnerabilities are or what's the best way for us to attack.
Mhm.
There's already stuff embedded in critical systems all over the place, and they're little sleeping time bombs waiting to go off when triggered
Yeah.
by the adversaries. So at Intrusion, one of the things that we're focused on, it turns out, is understanding that surveillance activity way before there's an actual attack. And that's an important step in the whole process, is even preventing, that kind of surveillance that can lead to uh, worse things later on.
And in that, there are so many areas in which let's start with the either operational technology or even third-party suppliers. I'm, being from agriculture, I am always very interested in the third-party suppliers that provide agricultural products. For example, Smithfield, they make sausages, but they don't buy their own, they don't grow their own fennel. They get it from a small mom and pop, down
Sure.
in Eastern Kentucky somewhere. But that small mom and pop does not have a cybersecurity protocol. And so when they upload their data, they're uploading everything else. So let's talk about, operational technology and third-party suppliers.
Sure. Sure. One of the things that I learned when I was at General Motors was we started looking at our supply chain and critical vulnerabilities that we had, both technical and also just diversity of suppliers and so on. And there's been some things that have happened in the automotive industry that I think are instructive and apply to almost any other space, including agriculture as well. It turns out when the big tsunami hit Japan, um, there was a supplier of black paint that supplied, they had 90%, 95% market share for black paint for every automotive manufacturer in the world. And
Wow.
maybe you noticed, maybe you didn't, but after that tsunami, for a while, there weren't any black cars being produced because the world ran out of that kind of black paint. But, let's say an adversary decided, that, um, black paint was something in their strategic interest. They could have taken out that factory. To your
Mm,
point, in the agricultural space, um, everything, every piece of farm equipment now in modern
that's right.
farming is hooked up to the internet
Hmm.
somehow.
Hmm.
I grew up on a farm in Western Illinois, and we didn't have any computers then. I visit some of my cousins now, and it looks like a data center that they're running. um, and so, if you wanted to interrupt or disrupt, there's a lot of things you could do there to disable, both equipment, but also supply chain, food supply. The list is sort of endless,
Yeah,
and all it
yeah,
takes is a little bit of creativity, and you could do a lot of harm.
that's true. That is very true. And so I think it consists of all those things: distribution, the operational technology, third-party suppliers, and of course your data systems. Who, first of all, who everybody's very concerned about, AI and data centers and who owns the data and where is it being located and how is it being aggregated. And so that's a conversation that still needs to go on because of, all the privacy concerns that they're around.
Yeah, I agree. And, data is critical to all the things that we do, all the decision making that anybody makes, down to the local farmer or the local store owner or the local manufacturer, the local utility. It doesn't matter. In today's operational world, you rely on data to make critical decisions. Disruption of that, or the introduction of false data into those spaces, can have very devastating effects. And it's one of the concerns I think people have about AI is this hallucination factor that we've seen evidence of, where I think about the healthcare world, and
Mm.
if there's manufactured data about human health that turns out to be false, or not accurate, it could lead to some pretty devastating effects. And so I think and I don't want to sound like, crying wolf everywhere, but we need to be crying wolf in at least a few places, and get a handle on this, or I think we'll regret it later on.
And that moves us on to modernization. So, modernization increases connectivity, automation, and data integration. So, how do you balance that? How do organizations balance innovation, efficiency with resilience and security?
Well, I think it's a juggling act. I think if you're not focused on modernization and innovation in particular, it's clear you're going to get left behind. And I don't think any of us want that. But it also has to come about as a result of some sort of reasonable governance process. One of the things that I really helped sponsor in almost every organization I became a part of, including Intrusion today, is to make sure that we're devoting a reasonable amount of our time and energy and efforts on both innovation and modernization. And on the innovation side, the best way I can describe it is sponsor some innovative activities that have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And at the beginning, you're trying out some new thing that you think may have promise and relevancy to your organization's future. In the middle, you're learning all of the things that you didn't know when you started the journey. And at the end of the experiment, you're making a very critical decision about whether you're going to continue to invest in that or shut it down and go on to something else. And I think the mistake a lot of organizations make is they forget that last part. They let experiments go on way too long. They don't capture the learning, and it ends up being a waste of money. And eventually, the innovation effort collapses because people say, "Oh, that was a waste of time. We didn't learn anything. That was somebody's pet project or whatever." And what I found is having that highly governed end state where you're actively making a decision to either go forward or stop, and capture the learnings and share those learnings, really helps advance the the um, credibility, I think, of your innovation efforts, and also the willingness of people to participate in them in the future. And it's also better for the suppliers and everybody else who you're dealing with, because the truth is, most large organizations can kill small companies or small innovative ideas pretty easily by just overwhelming them with um, uh, the bigger organization's culture and what have you. On the modernization side, I think we talked about that earlier. It's useful life, just the discipline to make sure that at all points you're actively thinking about what needs to be upgraded, what needs to be replaced. And I will tell you from experience, there's really good economics behind doing that. You'll save way more money by having a reasonably governed modernization program than the start, stop, hurry up, do everything at once, emergency, when everything starts to fail. The old culture of it's not broken, let's not fix it is just the worst way to run these environments today.
Absolutely. And I had to chuckle when you talked about, some organizations coming in, swooping in and having their own culture dominate the new innovative company that they wanted to acquire because of that innovation, right? They
Yeah,
they wanted to acquire them because they were new. I remember being at Lotus, right, when IBM
sure.
swooped in, and boy, that was difficult. That was
Yes, I can
difficult
imagine.
for
Yeah,
for us during that time. But we some of us came out on the other side fine, some of us did not.
yeah. Well, and I think you have to do the innovation part of the organization the right way. If you set up a we're the cool kids and everybody else isn't
Mm,
kind of culture, that's a recipe for disaster.
yeah,
I think the right way to do it is let's make everybody the cool kids. Let's participate in this and make sure it's clear, what the roles and responsibilities are. But everybody should gain from this. And innovation doesn't come from a single individual or
right,
a
right.
team that's, isolated off in the woods somewhere, generally.
So, what proactive steps should energy organizations prioritize right now to reduce both operational and cyber risk? Is it zero trust? Is it workforce readiness? Is it private public coordination? Is it all of the above?
I think it's some piece of all of the above. But first, it starts with just an inventory and an assessment of where are we at today. It's the situational awareness part of this journey that I think is the most critical. We pay a lot of attention to our quarterly financials. We pay a lot of attention to, the big capital investments we're making, those kinds of things. Um, but often we stop or don't do well the situational awareness of, where do I sit in the world? Um, and what are my competitors doing that I'm either not doing or I'm doing better? What lessons have we learned from, the last several years, whether it's Ukraine or the Middle East or anywhere else? And if you do that situational awareness exercise as an organization and have 360-degree coverage of everything you're doing,
Mhm.
then you can begin to, I think, sort out what the priorities are for you to make more progress than just, measuring profits each quarter or what have you.
Okay, so we're rounding about. I'm looking at the time here. I want to be respectful of the time that you have. Looking ahead 5 years, putting on your, Carmack the Incredible hat. What concerns you most about the future of energy infrastructure security, and what gives you optimism?
Well, I think there's a lot of things to be optimistic about to start with. I think we are looking at a future, particularly in the energy space, where we've got a lot of really good options in terms of things that we can do to be more efficient. And I think in a lot of areas we've already made great progress. And I expect those things will not only continue but advance at an even more rapid rate. But it's also clear that we have some challenges. We have, especially with AI, great demand for energy that it looks like it's going to be a little difficult to meet. Um, we have ambitions to do many things with not only AI, but technology in terms of better distribution of energy. It's still, as you know, energy is still a localized kind of
Yeah.
problem. It's have or have not. And,
Mhm.
the ability to, be ethical and fair and 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 still responsible. There's going to be some really interesting challenges there. Climate is always a concern when you come to have a discussion about energy infrastructure, and so I think we're going to have some really serious, and I hope the U.S. brings its convening power to bear, and help create the right kind of conversations, not only in the U.S. but globally, about how we address some of those big challenges. Um, and it doesn't matter whether you believe in wind or solar or gas and oil or wave technology or anything. All of those parts need to be a part of the conversation about, what are we going to do? How are we going to survive as a society, and how are we going to manage some of the ethical issues that are bound to continue to come along? It's very clear to me that because of environmental issues, there's a lot of human displacement that's going to occur over the next couple of years, with large percentages of the population having to physically move from where they live today because of environmental or other kinds of conditions, and that ought to be a concern for everybody, really, because those are the things that lead to wars, lead to human suffering, disease, and all kinds of other challenges. We know from history about that, and hopefully we have information and intelligence to do a better job of dealing with it.
I hope so too. And in that, if there was one piece of advice I heard, I really did hone in on what you said, and it's the intentionality of how we are going to go about these things in the next 5 years. So, if you were going to give one piece of advice to energy infrastructure leaders right now, what would that be?
Um, it would be get together and collaborate on designing the future that we all need and want. Um, because operating alone in little silos isn't probably going to get us there. I think if you think about all of the really great things that have happened in history, the vast majority of them happen when a group of people come together and collaborate and put their collective effort together to make something happen. And I think more than anything, we need that right now. We need a lot of conversation, dialogue, collaboration, decision making, and leadership to advance all of the things that we're concerned about. And retreating into our little cubby holes and saying, "Oh, everything's fine," probably isn't gonna get us there.
I wholeheartedly agree, and it's C to the three: collaboration, communication, and coordination.
That's right. That's exactly right.
As we close today's conversation, I want to thank Tony Scott for sharing his extraordinary insights, leadership experiences, and perspective on the evolving challenges facing our nation's critical infrastructure. Today's discussion on energy reminds us that protecting critical infrastructure is not simply a technology issue, it's a national security, economic stability, and public trust imperative. The future will require stronger collaboration across government, industry, academia, and other communities to build resilient, secure, and adaptive systems capable of supporting the next generation of innovation and growth. Thank you to our audience for joining us. Thank you for Tony for his perspective, and we look forward to continuing these important conversations. Until next time, stay informed, stay resilient, and as Mr. Spock would say, live long and prosper.